The February blizzard that year swallowed the whole mountain town of Hollow Creek, burying its timber rooftops under ice so thick it seemed bent on erasing every trace of human life. Yet no cold outside could ever match the frost in the heart of Cyrus Vane, the heavy-set landowner with gold rings glinting on his fingers, and a honeyed smile that hid a rotting soul. Over nothing more than a barren patch of land at the edge of town, he ordered his debt collector Garrett Pike to throw Tessa Holloway out of her own timber cabin, a 28-year-old single mother, thin and worn, her chestnut hair tangled, her chest caving with every dry cough from the pneumonia that had tormented her all through the long winter, a woman who'd buried her husband just 6 months earlier and still carried the cruel lie that he'd been a thief. "You've got 2 minutes to walk out that door before I make you," Pike said, his voice flat as sheet ice, while Tessa clung trembling to the doorframe, her eyes still clouded with worry for the 5-year-old son she'd just managed to send to a neighbor's house, so he wouldn't have to witness any of this. She stumbled into the blinding white, her thin shoes sinking deep into the ice, her breath coming in ragged gasps, one single thought driving her forward, that she had to reach her boy, until her knees buckled beside the frozen wagon ruts and the whole world narrowed into a dark, collapsing tunnel. And in that very moment, from deep within the snow-laden pines came a low, rumbling growl. Then the dim glow of carriage lanterns tore through the storm, and a tall figure stepped down, black hair streaked with silver at the temples, a faint scar running down his left cheek, eyes gray and cold as steel tempered in ice. They called him the Master of Ravenscar Mountain, a name the whole town whispered in fear, and beside him moved an entire pack of massive gray hounds, big as wolves, circling silently around the woman lying motionless in the snow. He knelt, pulled the heavy coat from his own shoulders, and laid it over her freezing body. And as Cyrus Vane stood smug behind his warm doorway believing he'd won, he had no idea he'd just awakened the one man on Earth, willing to burn everything down to protect a mother the whole town had turned its back on, and that the mistake he'd just made would be his very last. If this story of courage and justice touches your heart, hit that like button to give strength to kindness. Don't forget to share this video with the people you love to spread its message. And subscribe to the channel today so you never miss the emotional stories still to come. To understand how this tragic moment came to be, we must look back to 2 months before that fateful storm came down on Hollow Creek. At that time, Tessa Holloway's small wooden house on the edge of town had already become a place where the cold seeped into every grain of the boards, slipping through gaps she no longer had enough money to seal with tar or scraps of cloth. Every morning, she woke before the sky had time to brighten, her thin hands trembling not only from the bitter cold, but from the dry coughing fits that had followed her since the beginning of winter, coughs that emptied her chest and left a sharp metallic taste in her mouth, a taste she tried to hide, tried to swallow down each time her little boy looked up at her with his clear eyes. She sat beside the old sewing machine set near the ice-covered window, the weak oil lamp casting over her pale face, the tired lines of a woman far older than 28, and she sewed, mended, and stitched each loose button back into place for the people in the area, who were still willing to hire her, in exchange for a few small coins that were never enough to buy both heating coal and medicine at the same time. There were nights when she had to choose, and she always chose coal, always chose warmth for the boy over pills for the chest that was slowly failing inside her, because to Tessa, her body had become nothing more than a tool that had to keep going until it couldn't go any further, while Eli was the only reason her heart still beat. The boy was 5 years old, with tangled blonde hair exactly like his father's, and he often sat cross-legged beneath the sewing machine, playing with the scraps of cloth she cut away, arranging them into shapes he called horses, trains, and animals from the stories she told him every night. Eli didn't understand why meals were becoming smaller and smaller, why his mother coughed so much, why on some nights she held him so tightly and cried silently in the dark. But he was a good child, strangely sensitive, and he learned not to beg for things, learned to fetch the thin blanket by himself, and cover his mother when she collapsed over the table from exhaustion, his tiny, clumsy hands tugging the blanket all the way up to her shoulders as though he were the one protecting her. Tessa looked at her son with all the love and pain of a mother who knew full well she was sliding down a slope with no stopping place. And she told herself that if they could only get through this winter, if they could just get through it, Then spring would come. There would be more work. Her health would improve. And everything would be all right, even though deep inside, she wasn't sure she still believed it. In the evenings, after she managed to place a few slices of dry bread and a bowl of thin soup on the table, she held Eli in her lap beside the poor little fire in the hearth and told him about distant lands where the sun was always warm and no one had to be hungry or cold. And the boy rested his head against her chest, listening to his mother's weary heartbeat, slowly falling asleep with a smile on his lips that she would have traded everything to protect. She kissed his forehead, pulled the blanket over him, then returned to the unfinished pile of mending beneath the lamplight, because it had to be delivered to the customer tomorrow, and every coin now was as precious as blood. It was on a night just like that, while the wind hissed through the cracks in the door, and the first snowflakes of the season began to fall outside, that Tessa heard the sound of hooves, then the scrape of wheels grinding over the frozen road that led to her house, a sound that didn't belong to this hour, and didn't belong to any kindly visitor. She stopped sewing, her heart pounding, and through the frost-blurred window, she saw a fine carriage come to a halt before the gate, and from it stepped a man in a heavy coat, holding an envelope stamped with a vivid red wax seal. She didn't know his name, not yet, but the way he looked at her poor little house with the eyes of someone pricing an object made another kind of cold, colder than winter itself, slip deep into her bones, and Tessa tightened the blanket around the shoulders of her sleeping child, sensing that the burden pressing down on her fragile shoulders was about to become heavier than anything she had ever carried. That vivid red envelope was only the beginning of a winter far longer than any calendar of seasons could measure, because the loneliness Tessa was carrying didn't truly come from poverty, but from an invisible stain that had clung to the Holloway name for the past 6 months, ever since the day people carried Tom's body back from the mine. Tom Holloway had once been a well-loved man in Hollow Creek, a strong miner with a generous smile and calloused hands, always ready to help a neighbor rebuild a roof after a storm or dig a well in the middle of a dry season. The man who had married shy Tessa from another town and brought her home to the wooden house beside the forest, with the promise that one day they would have enough, that their child would grow up never having to know hunger. But that promise had been buried with him beneath the cold soil on the hillside, and what was crueler than death itself was what people began whispering afterward, that Tom had stolen from the mining company where he worked, that he had pocketed a large sum of the mine owner's money before the accident happened, that perhaps it was his own greed that had driven him to risk going down into the old forbidden tunnel and lose his life there. No one had any proof. No one had ever seen Tom spend a single suspicious coin. Their house remained just as poor and bare as before, and Tessa still had to sew and mend for hire day after day. But once a rumor slips from the mouths of people, it doesn't need truth in order to live. It breeds on its own, grows on its own, roots itself in the human heart until the whole town believes that the widow Holloway is the wife of a thief. And so the doors that had once opened wide for her and her husband began closing one after another. The eyes that had once been friendly now avoided her, or looked at her with pity mixed with contempt. The women who had once sat beside her in church now gathered their skirts and stepped aside when she passed, as though her poverty and shame might spread like sickness. The people who hired her to sew became fewer and fewer, not because her skill had faded, but because they were reluctant to bring their clothes to the house of a woman carrying a bad name. And those who still came paid her less, bargained harder, as though they were doing her a kindness by lowering themselves enough to cross her threshold. Tessa endured it all with a silence that made people mistake her for defeated. But inside that thin frame and those trembling shoulders was a dignity nothing could shake, because she knew the man she had shared her life with, knew Tom Holloway had never taken a penny from anyone, knew he had worked himself to exhaustion only, so that each night he could bring home a scrap of bread and a smile for his wife and child. And she would rather starve to death than let anyone force her to believe that the husband she loved had been a thief. She never argued against the rumors, never fought with the judging eyes, because she understood that for those who had already chosen to believe the worst, every word of defense would only give them more satisfaction, and she poured all the strength she had left into one single task, shielding Eli from the poison of people's mouths, teaching him that his father was a good man, an honest man, no matter what the world outside might say. Whenever she took her son through town to buy a little salt or lamp oil, she walked with her head high through the whispers, one hand holding tightly to Eli's small hand, teaching him through the way she carried herself that dignity was something no one could steal unless you willingly gave it away. And though the boy didn't yet understand all of it, he had already learned to walk beside his mother without lowering his head. At night, once Eli had fallen deeply asleep, Tessa sometimes allowed herself to sink down beside the dying fire, clutching Tom's old shirt, still carrying his scent, against her chest as she silently let the tears fall, not because of what people said, but because of the terrible loneliness of a woman who had to bear both the grief of widowhood and the rejection of an entire community alone. And it was on a morning when snow lay white over the trail, as she opened the door to sweep the ice from the front step, that Tessa saw it lying there, a letter placed neatly before her door, the thick envelope stamped with the red wax seal of the Landlord Company. And when her frozen fingers trembled as she tore it open, each bold printed line appeared before her eyes like a sentence of doom, informing her that the debt on this house had come due, and that she had 30 days to pay it in full if she didn't want the property seized. 30 days slipped by as quickly as sand through her fingers, and although Tessa had knocked on every door she could think of, had tried to borrow from old acquaintances, who had now turned their backs on her, had even sold the thin wedding ring that was the last fragile thing she owned, in order to gather a small amount of money to take to the bank, she still couldn't come anywhere close to the enormous sum demanded by that red letter. And then, on a freezing afternoon when the sky hung heavy with clouds warning of the great storm to come, the sound of hooves rang out again before the gate, this time sharper and colder than before. The man who stepped down was not the one who had delivered the earlier letter, but a tall, thin figure with a hollow face, small eyes as sharp as a hawk's, and a long black coat brushing across the snow, and when he introduced himself as Garrett Pike, the asset recovery representative for the Landlord Company. His voice was so flat and emotionless that Tessa felt it was colder than the wind outside. He didn't wait to be invited in, but simply pushed the door open and stepped into the cramped wooden house, his hawk eyes sweeping over the poor little room before stopping on Eli, who was sitting tucked into the corner, clutching his scraps of cloth, and the indifferent look he cast toward the child made Tessa instinctively step forward and place herself between her son and the strange man. Pike pulled a thick stack of papers from inside his coat, dropped it heavily onto the old wooden table, then said in a level voice, as though reading an inventory of goods, that the company had decided to offer her a way out, that instead of allowing the house to be seized and leaving with nothing, she could sign the document selling the entire plot of land and the house back to the Vane Company for a price he called merciful, a sum so low it was insulting, not even 1/10 of the land's true value, but according to him, it was a rare kindness she shouldn't refuse. Tessa looked down at the paper, then lifted her eyes and looked straight into his hawk-like stare, and with all the calm she could still gather, she said there had been a mistake, that her husband, Tom Holloway, had paid off nearly the entire debt on this house before he died, and that she had the receipts to prove it. Trembling, she walked to the small wooden box on the shelf and took out a bundle of yellowed papers she had guarded like treasure, receipts clearly recording each payment Tom had made steadily over 2 years, with signatures and dates, and she placed them on the table before Pike, with a thin thread of hope that this plain black and white truth would finally end the nightmare. But Garrett Pike merely glanced over the receipts with indifferent eyes, the corner of his mouth lifting into a cold half-smile. Then he pulled from his case a file stamped with the official seal of the Hollow Creek Bank, opened it, and pushed it toward her, saying that the scraps of paper she was holding had no legal value at all, that they were merely personal copies she had kept for herself, while the official records stored at the bank, the only records a court would recognize, showed no payments of the kind she claimed. Tessa took the file in trembling hands, her eyes fixed on the cold printed numbers on the page, and the blood in her body seemed to freeze when she realized that according to what was written there, Tom had never paid a single coin. The entire debt remained untouched, with interest piled on top of it, as though the 2 years her husband had carried in money earned through sweat and exhaustion had never existed. She stammered that this was impossible, that she had seen Tom go to make those payments with her own eyes, that the receipts in her hands were real, but the more she spoke, the more she felt the ground giving way beneath her. Because in one horrifying instant, she understood that someone had touched the bank records, someone with enough power to erase every trace of the money her husband had worked himself raw to earn, and to turn her family from honest debtors into people who had nothing on paper. Pike gathered the file back, folded the land sale papers neatly, and set a pen on top of them, then said in a voice that had lost all patience that she could choose to sign her name right now. Take the small amount of money, and leave quietly, or wait until the day the company came to enforce the seizure, and threw her and her child into the street without a penny to their names. And he advised her to be wise, because no one in this town had ever fought the Vane Company, and remained whole afterward. Tessa stood there, her hands gripping her useless receipts, feeling clearly for the first time that the invisible net tightening around her wasn't some cruel turn of fate, but a trap deliberately laid, a cold scheme in which she was only a small helpless prey, and though her heart was screaming for justice, she stood silent in the frozen house, powerless, alone, with no one to call for help. After Garrett Pike left, leaving the unsigned land sale papers lying alone on the table like a silent threat, Tessa stayed awake the entire night beside the dying fire, straining her mind for a way out that she already knew did not exist. And near dawn, through the ice-covered window, she saw the sky turn the heavy lead gray that belonged to the fiercest snowstorms. The kind of weather people in these mountains understood could bury an entire house in a single night. A dark premonition rose inside her when that same morning, one of the company's errand boys rode his horse all the way to her gate, not even bothering to dismount, only throwing out a cold sentence that Mr. Cyrus Vane had run out of patience, that if she still refused to sign by noon, the company's men would come to enforce the eviction that very day, storm or no storm, and the shadow of the horse vanished behind the falling snow, leaving Tessa standing frozen at the threshold, understanding that the hour she had always feared had finally come. In that moment, amid the despair tightening around her weak, aching chest, there was only one thing Tessa knew for certain she had to do, and that was not to let Eli stay and witness what was about to happen, not to let her son's clear eyes be branded, with the image of his mother being dragged out of the only home he had ever known, because she would rather bear every humiliation alone than let that wound carve itself into the tender soul of her child. She hurriedly wrapped Eli in the thickest wool sweater he owned, her trembling hands fastening each button, smoothing down his tousled blonde hair, trying to keep her voice calm as she told him that today he would spend the afternoon at Mrs. Fay's house, that Mrs. Fay had an oven full of fragrant ginger cookies and a lazy tabby cat Eli had always loved to pet. The boy looked up at his mother with those strangely sensitive eyes, seeming to feel that something was wrong beneath her forced smile, and he asked softly whether she was all right, why her eyes were so red, making Tessa kneel down to his height, cradle that small face in her calloused hands, and say that she was fine, only a little tired, that he was the most precious thing in her whole world, and no matter what happened, she would always be with him. She carried him in her weakened arms, wading through the deep snow all the way to Mrs. Fay's house at the end of the trail, the one kind older woman who still had not turned her back on her. And when she gave Eli into the woman's warm embrace, Tessa held him tight one last time, breathing in the familiar scent of his hair as though she wanted to carve it into her soul, then kissed his forehead and whispered that she loved him so very much, more than the sun and the moon together, the same words she used every night to soothe him to sleep. Eli waved his little hand goodbye to his mother through the doorway, his innocent smile the last image Tessa carried with her, as she turned and walked back toward her own house through the wind that was growing more violent by the minute. Each heavy step sinking deep into the snow, her heart both lightened because she had brought her son somewhere safe and twisted with pain, because she knew she would now have to face the storm, both the storm of heaven and earth and the storm of human cruelty, entirely alone. By the time she reached home, the snow was falling thickly, the wind beating against the wooden boards until they creaked, and she sat down beside the weak little fire, drawing the thin blanket around her frail shoulders as they shook from coughing and from the bone-deep cold, quietly waiting for what could no longer be avoided. At that same moment, in the warm oak-paneled room of his mansion in the center of town, Cyrus Vane sat behind his enormous desk, turning the gold ring on his plump finger, listening as Garrett Pike reported that the Holloway woman was still stubbornly refusing to sign. And a contemptuous smile appeared on the landlord's soft, bloated face as he waved one hand and gave the order in a voice sweet with cruelty, saying that there was no need to wait any longer. Take the men there and drag her out of that place today. The snowstorm would only make it better, so the whole town could see clearly what happened to anyone who dared stand against Cyrus Vane. And he took a sip of shimmering red wine, never suspecting for even a moment that the ruthless command he had just spoken, inside that comfortable room, would be the first stone rolling down the mountainside, the beginning of an avalanche that would sweep away everything he had worked so carefully to build. And then, the exact moment that would change her fate forever finally arrived. The heavy thud of the front door splintering open broke the eerie silence as Garrett Pike and his ruthless men stormed into the cabin, showing no mercy as they dragged Tessa out into the freezing fury of the blizzard. Stranded in the blinding white, her chest caving with dry coughs, her knees finally buckled beside the frozen wagon ruts, and the world narrowed into a dark, collapsing tunnel. But before the frost could claim her breath, the master of Ravenscar Mountain appeared from the pines like a dark shadow, scattering the thugs and lifting her into his warm carriage. When Tessa slowly came back to consciousness, the first thing she felt was not the familiar bone-deep cold, but warmth wrapping around her whole body, a strange and soothing warmth so gentle that in that first hazy moment she thought she had died and was drifting inside some dream, until the familiar dry cough pulled her back to reality and her eyes cracked open to meet a scene she did not know at all. She was lying on a wide bed covered with thick, soft fur blankets, inside a cozy wood-paneled room where a great fire crackled in a stone hearth. The walls hung with animal hides and bookshelves reaching all the way to the ceiling, a place more elegant and lavish than anywhere she had ever set foot. And in the instant when memory came rushing back, the storm, the freezing snow swallowing her beside the frozen wheel tracks, a violent panic exploded in her chest and she bolted upright, calling her son's name, Eli, her Eli, the little boy she had left at Mrs. Fay's house, the child she had not been able to return for. She struggled to climb out of bed, though her whole body was spent, and her legs had no strength left in them, her red-rimmed eyes darting around in search, her mouth stammering broken pleas that she had to go find her son, that her child was waiting. And it was then that a deep, low voice sounded from the corner of the room, a rough voice like stone grinding against stone, yet strangely carrying a calm that made her panic falter. She lifted her head and saw him, the tall man from among the snow-covered pines, now sitting in a large armchair across the room, his black hair touched with silver at the temples, a faint scar running down his left cheekbone, and those steel-gray eyes looking at her, though in that gaze there was none of the threat she had braced herself to face, only a stillness almost gentle enough to be confusing. He told her slowly that her son was safe, that during the night he had sent his most trusted man through the storm to the house of the woman named Fay to bring word and keep watch, that the boy was sleeping peacefully beside the old woman's fireplace and did not know anything had happened to his mother. And he repeated it once more, slowly and clearly, that she did not need to fear for her child, that the only thing she needed to do now was lie still and recover. There was something in the certainty of that voice that made Tessa, though still doubtful and trembling, slowly loosen and sink back onto the pillow, tears rolling down her pale cheeks with relief mixed with exhaustion. And just then the bedroom door opened, and an older man with spectacles and a kindly manner stepped inside, with a doctor's leather bag in his hand, introduced by the tall man as Dr. Hale. Dr. Hale sat down beside the bed, placed a hand on her forehead, pressed his stethoscope to her rasping chest, and listened for a long time, then shook his head softly, and said that her lungs had been badly damaged by illness, that lying exposed in the freezing snow had very nearly taken her life, and that if she had been found only a little later, no doctor on earth could have saved her. As though he had guessed the question circling in Tessa's mind, the tall man spoke up and explained in a low, even voice that Hollow Creek had only one clinic, and the doctor there had long lived off Cyrus Vane's money and favors, making him little better than Vane's lackey, so taking her there would have been the same as handing her over to the very man who wanted her dead. And besides, the storm had buried the entire road down the mountain so no carriage could pass, while his Ravenscar estate on the mountainside was the closest, warmest, safest place to hold on to the fragile breath still left inside her. Tessa lay there listening, her eyes moving from the doctor's kind face to the scarred and weathered face of the man who had saved her. And inside her confused mind rose a deep bewilderment, because everything she had ever heard about the master of Ravenscar Mountain had been fear-filled whispers, stories about a powerful and formidable man the whole town knew better than to cross. And yet that frightening man was the very one who had taken off his coat and covered her in the middle of the snowstorm, had brought her back and warmed her, had sent someone through the storm at night to find her child. And the strange contrast between that fearsome reputation and those gentle actions was something she could not explain, so she only closed her eyes inside the unfamiliar warmth and, for the first time in many months, felt that she was not entirely alone. The next day, when the storm had eased and the first weak rays of sunlight began slipping through the gray clouds, Tessa was lying propped against the pillows, her lungs still aching, but her breathing steadier, thanks to the bitter medicine Dr. Hale had left behind, when the bedroom door burst open and a familiar clear voice rang out, tearing through the quiet, "Mama," and then a small figure with tangled blonde hair rushed across the wide room, climbed onto the bed, and threw himself into her arms. Tessa caught her child against her, her thin arms tightening around that small warm body as though she were afraid he would vanish if she let go, and her tears spilled freely, rolling down into Eli's sun-scented hair, while she kissed his forehead, his cheeks, his tiny hands, stammering his name again and again as if she still couldn't believe her son was truly here, safe and whole in her embrace. Eli chattered innocently to his mother, telling her that last night a very big man had come to Mrs. Fay's house, that he had enormous dogs that scared him a little at first, but then one of them had let him pet its huge head, that Mrs. Fay had baked ginger cookies and he had eaten until he was full and slept very well. And Tessa listened with a smile trembling through her tears, her heart flooded with a deep gratitude toward the stranger, who had silently kept the most precious thing in her life from being harmed. Across the room, the master of Ravenscar Mountain stood leaning against the doorframe, both arms folded over his chest, quietly watching that reunion with thoughtful gray eyes, and though his scarred face revealed no emotion, something in that cold gaze softened for a moment, when he saw the frail mother clutching her child to her heart, as though the sight had touched some distant memory buried deep inside him. When the rush of emotion had settled, Eli curled into his mother's lap and began rambling about all the little things children talk about, and then, for reasons only his young mind understood, his thoughts drifted toward his dead father. He looked up and asked his mother in a sad little voice whether Papa knew the two of them were here, saying he missed those evenings, when Papa sat beside the lamp in the woodshop behind the house, carefully writing and drawing in the small leather-bound notebook he always kept hidden, the notebook Papa had once lovingly tapped against Eli's forehead and said was his most important secret, the thing that would one day protect their whole family. Tessa gently stroked her son's hair, her heart tightening at the mention of Tom, and she thought it was only one of the many scattered memories the child still carried of his father, an old habit with nothing special behind it, so she softly told him that Papa was always watching over the two of them from above, that he was the best and smartest man she had ever known, then held him close and hummed a lullaby under her breath until the boy's eyes grew heavy in the warmth of the fireplace. But by the doorway, the child's innocent words about the leather-bound notebook hidden in the woodshop, about the secret his dead father had once insisted would protect the whole family, had not slipped past the ears of the man standing there in silence, and his cold gray eyes narrowed slightly in thought, because to a man who had grown far too familiar with schemes and deadly secrets, he understood that an ordinary miner would have no reason to hide a notebook and call it the thing that would protect his family, unless something inside those pages held a truth someone was willing to kill to keep buried. He said nothing, asked nothing, only quietly carved that detail into his sharp mind like the first piece of a still blurred picture, then turned and left the room, leaving mother and child together in that rare peace, while he himself began to feel the first outlines of a truth far darker than a cruel foreclosure taking shape, and the instinct of a man who had survived countless dangers told him that the fate of this woman and her son might have been decided by something far more valuable than their poor wooden house. In the days that followed, as her health slowly recovered enough for her to sit up and take careful steps around the room, Tessa began to understand more about the place where she and her son had found refuge, and about the man who had taken them in, and what she observed only deepened the confusion inside her. Ravenscar Estate was not a house in the ordinary sense, but an immense structure of stone and oak standing high on the mountainside, completely isolated from the town below, surrounded by dense pine forest and sheer cliffs, a lonely fortress amid the wild, and from its great windows one could look out over the entire Hollow Creek Valley, small and distant beneath the sky. The man the whole region spoke of with wary respect as the master of Ravenscar Mountain was truly named Sloane Ashford, and through the scattered words of the quiet servants in the estate, Tessa gradually began to understand the scale of the power held by the man who had saved her, an underworld force that even the most powerful men in Hollow Creek, men such as Cyrus Vane, had to treat with caution, because Sloane held control over the freight routes crossing the mountain range, governed business arrangements no official paper ever recorded, and his presence cast a shadow both protective and frightening over a vast stretch of land. People whispered all kinds of things about him in the taverns and market corners of town, that he had single-handedly brought down an entire gang of robbers who tried to seize a mountain road, that those who dared betray him disappeared without leaving a trace, that he kept a pack of enormous hunting dogs trained to tear apart anyone who dared set foot on his territory without permission. And each story, told again and again, added another layer of dark mist to that chilling reputation. Tessa had seen those dogs with her own eyes, large gray-coated creatures with keen golden eyes, and powerful bodies like wolves, following Sloane in silence like loyal shadows, obeying him with nothing more than a flick of his hand or a low sound from his throat. And she couldn't deny that they made her shiver, but she also noticed that those very fierce beasts lay gently at Eli's feet whenever the boy ran over to stroke them, as though they could sense that this child stood under their master's protection. The longer Tessa stayed inside the estate, the more she realized that behind that fearsome reputation and cold, weathered exterior, Sloane Ashford was a man who lived by a private code so strict it was almost strange. Because though his power was built on shadowed roads the law could not reach, he had limits he never crossed. The servants said he had never taken a coin from the weak, had never tolerated men who bullied women or children, and that those who worked under him understood there were lines that, once crossed, would bring a terrible price. He spoke little, almost never smiled, and spent most of his time alone in the book-filled study or riding across the snow-covered slopes with his dogs, a solitary man who had chosen to live apart from the human world, a world he seemed both to despise and to distrust. Tessa watched him from a distance whenever he passed quietly through the hallway, or stood lost in thought by the window, looking down into the valley, and hundreds of unanswered questions stirred inside her, because she couldn't reconcile the image of the terrifying powerful man from the rumors with the man who had knelt in the snowstorm and taken off his own coat to cover a dying stranger, who had sent someone through the storm at night to find her child, who had stood silently in the doorway, watching mother and son reunited with a strange flicker of tenderness in his steel-gray eyes. She wondered what had shaped a man into such a contradiction, someone who was both the dread of an entire region and the savior of her life, and in the end, behind that cold outer shell and dark reputation, who Sloane Ashford truly was. A question that drew Tessa in more deeply the longer she thought about it, as though from this point on, her fate had been tied to the mysterious man of this mountain in a way she could not yet understand. The answer to that mystery lay deep in a past Sloane Ashford had never told anyone, an old wound that had scarred over on the outside but still bled quietly within. And that night, when the whole estate had sunk into silence and only the wind howled beyond the cliffs, he sat alone in his study before the fire, turning a tarnished brass button between his fingers, the same button he had carried with him for so many years, letting the image of his dead mother return the way she always did, whenever he witnessed an injustice too cruel to bear. Many years earlier, in another poor town hundreds of miles away, a young woman named Maeve had given birth to Sloane, without a husband at her side, because the father had left without a word of farewell the moment he learned about the child, leaving that single mother to face alone an entire community, ready to cast stones at any woman who dared bear a child out of wedlock. Maeve had done every kind of backbreaking work to raise her son, taking in laundry, scrubbing floors for wealthy families, receiving pitiful coins and contemptuous looks in return. And the boy Sloane grew up under the rejection of the whole town, chased away by other children, called cruel names by adults, learning very early that this world had no place for compassion when it came to the lowly and powerless. He had watched his mother grow thinner day by day beneath the weight of poverty and the shame of being cast out, had seen her cough blood on freezing winter nights exactly the way Tessa was coughing now, had knelt beside her bed begging passing neighbors to call a doctor. But not a single door opened, not one person was willing to spare even a little kindness to save a woman they believed wasn't worth saving. And Maeve had died in a wretched rented room, in the arms of her 12-year-old son, without a word of comfort, without any help from the community that had turned its back on her until her final breath. It was on the night his mother died that the boy Sloane swore to himself he would never again allow himself to be weak and helpless, that he would rise and seize the kind of power before which the world knew only how to bow. And in the years that followed, he walked by himself through countless hardships and dangers, building an entire empire on this mountain from nothing, becoming the man the whole region feared crossing. But no matter how great his power became, no matter how thick his cold armor grew, he never forgot the sight of his mother dying slowly in the chill of human indifference. And that was the one wound all his wealth and strength could never heal. That was why, when he found Tessa lying motionless in the snow, a sickly single mother abandoned by the whole town, coughing blood just like his mother long ago, cruelly thrown out into a blizzard to die because of the greed of powerful men, he saw Maeve's shadow in that trembling body, saw again all the helplessness and fury of the boy he had been kneeling beside his mother's bed. And something he thought had frozen long ago inside his chest suddenly surged up with violent force, an iron resolve that this time he would not stand by and watch, this time he would not let evil win. He sat in silence for a long while beside the fire, the scattered pieces slowly fitting together in his sharp mind. The child's words about his dead father's secret notebook, the way Cyrus Vane had defied even a blizzard to force a dying woman off a barren little piece of land that seemed worth almost nothing, the absurdity of a wealthy landlord craving a poor wooden house so desperately, and the instinct of a man who had survived countless schemes told him that behind all of this, there had to be a secret far greater than anyone had yet seen. When dawn began to tint the distant snow-covered peaks with pink, Sloane Ashford rose from his armchair, his gray eyes shining with a resolve as cold and sharp as a blade, and he knew exactly what he had to do next. Trace the trail and expose Cyrus Vane's true self and his dark calculations, beginning with finding the leather-bound notebook Tessa's dead husband had hidden away. The thing he sensed was the key to unlocking the whole truth. As soon as the roads down the mountain had been cleared after the storm, Sloane acted without delay, but he understood that going to the old Holloway house in broad daylight was impossible, because that house had now fallen under the control of the Vane Company, and was surely being watched by Garrett Pike's men, so he chose the quietest approach, sending one of his most trusted and silent men, a reserved fellow named Boone, who knew every mountain trail like the back of his hand, to take advantage of the night and slip back to the abandoned wooden house. Before Boone set out, Sloane had questioned Tessa very carefully but tactfully, without alarming her, asking where the woodshop behind the house was, the place where Tom often sat writing, and where Tom had been in the habit of hiding things, and Tessa, though surprised by such meticulous concern, honestly told him that her husband had a small carpentry shed built separately behind the garden, where he made tables and chairs with his own hands and repaired farm tools, a place he regarded as his private sanctuary, and rarely allowed anyone to enter, even her. When night fell, Boone moved along the snow-covered tree lines, keeping far from the main road, silently approaching the dark and freezing house that no longer held any human warmth, slipping through the rusted door of the woodshop, and under the weak light of a carefully shielded storm lantern, he began searching every corner of the cramped space, filled with sawdust and dust-coated tools. He lifted each floorboard, tapped along every wooden wall to listen for hollow spaces, searched beneath the heavy workbench, and it took nearly 2 hours of patience in the skin-cutting cold before he discovered something unusual in a floorboard at the most hidden corner of the shop, a board that looked exactly like all the others, but rocked slightly when pressed, and when he used his knife to pry it up, a small hollow space appeared beneath it, lined with oilcloth against moisture, and tucked neatly inside was a worn old leather-bound notebook, exactly as the child had innocently described. Boone carefully wrapped the notebook inside his coat, set the floorboard back into place just as it had been, so no one would know anyone had ever come there, then quietly withdrew into the night, and by near dawn he had returned to Ravenscar Estate, placing directly into Sloane's hands the piece of evidence they both sensed was deeply important. Sloane sat beside the lamp in his study, his large scarred hands turning the notebook open with rare care, and from the very first pages he understood that this was no ordinary diary or household account book kept by a common miner. The yellowed pages were crowded with numbers written in careful, precise strokes. Long strings of measurements, Sloane guessed were depths and distances, strange symbols that looked like a private code Tom had invented for himself, puzzling abbreviations scattered along the margins, and among them were intricate hand-drawn sketches, tangled diagrams of lines that looked like maps of tunnels and veins of earth buried deep beneath the mountain. Some pages showed cross-sections of geological layers, certain strata shaded in different depths and marked with arrows and exclamation points, while others recorded something like test results, with percentages underlined again and again as though they were terribly important. And the more Sloane turned the pages, the more clearly he felt that the man who had written this notebook had been following the trail of something vast and dangerous, something he had taken pains to record in detail and hide from every eye. But though Sloane's sharp mind could see that the notebook contained a deadly secret, he still couldn't fully decode the meaning of those numbers, symbols, and tangled maps, because they belonged to a field of knowledge beyond his understanding, and he sat for a long time beside the lamp, his gray eyes fixed on the mysterious pages, knowing with certainty that he was holding the key to the truth, yet had no way to open the door, that the most important piece of the puzzle still lay beyond his reach, and that to understand what Tom Holloway had truly discovered beneath the earth, he would need a kind of knowledge only someone who understood the inside of the mountain could provide. To decode those mysterious pages, Sloane sought out one of the very few people he trusted and respected, an old man named Ezra, who had once been a skilled geological engineer, before leaving behind the world of mining corporations to live in seclusion on the mountainside, a man who understood the deep earth so well that people said he could look at a single handful of stone and read the story of millions of years hidden inside it. Sloane quietly invited the old man to the estate, placed the leather-bound notebook before him, and asked him to make sense of it, and Ezra put on his thick spectacles, took the notebook in hands trembling with age, and turned through each page with a focus that grew more strained by the moment, his white brows drawing together and then easing, his mouth murmuring technical terms under his breath, and the more he read, the more his wrinkled face revealed astonishment mixed with a fear he could not quite hide. At last the old man set the notebook down, lifted his clouded eyes to Sloane, and said in a low, hoarse voice that the man who had written this notebook was no ordinary miner, but someone with a keen eye and the instincts of a born prospector, because what was recorded here was the result of a painstaking geological survey carried out secretly and patiently over a long period of time. Ezra pointed to the strings of depth measurements and the carefully drawn cross-sections of earth layers, then explained that Tom Holloway had discovered that beneath the barren rock and soil of his own land, buried deep inside the mountain where the house stood, there lay an enormous and extraordinarily valuable mineral vein, not gold or silver like the common dreams of miners, but a light white metal called lithium, a mineral, the old man said, was being hunted more and more fiercely by new industries, something whose future value would become almost impossible to measure, enough to turn that poor little piece of land into one of the most valuable properties in the entire region. The percentages Tom had underlined again and again showed the purity of the ore, Ezra explained, and they were astonishingly high, revealing that this was a rare and exceptional vein, a true treasure lying quietly beneath the feet of a family that had still been struggling for every small coin to buy heating coal. But when he reached the final pages of the notebook, the old man's voice grew much heavier, his thin finger tracing lines of writing and symbols that looked entirely different, and he told Sloane that Tom had not only discovered the ore vein, But during his survey of the mountain's interior, the devoted miner had also stumbled upon something else, a dark truth tied directly to the Vane Land Company. According to what Tom had written, for many years Cyrus Vane's company had secretly buried and dumped toxic waste from its mining operations into abandoned tunnels and underground water channels running through the area, poisoning the water source used by the entire town of Hollow Creek. And Tom had carefully recorded the locations of the dumping points, described the signs of contamination he had observed in the soil and water, and gathered it all into a body of evidence strong enough to expose the crime of one of the wealthiest and most powerful forces in the region. Hearing this, Sloane sat in silence, and inside his sharp mind, the scattered pieces that had long been drifting apart finally locked together into a complete and chilling picture, because now he understood why Cyrus Vane was so desperate to seize that land, that he would defy even a snowstorm to throw a dying woman into the road. Not because of the poor wooden house, but because of the lithium treasure beneath it, and because of the desperate need to keep the secret of poisoned water buried forever. And in that same moment, a terrible suspicion began to rise inside Sloane, a suspicion that turned the blood in his body cold, because if Tom Holloway had held a secret powerful enough to destroy Cyrus Vane's entire empire, then his death in the tunnel collapse that the whole town still believed was a tragic work accident might not have been an accident at all, but a murder carefully staged to silence the only man who knew too much. And Sloane tightened his grip around the notebook, his gray eyes lit with a cold fire, knowing that the truth he had just touched was darker and more dangerous than anything he had imagined. With the decoded notebook in his hands, Sloane understood that Tom's evidence, no matter how valuable, was still not enough to bring down a power like Cyrus Vane. He needed more pieces, needed someone who had gone deep into Tom Holloway's death from another angle. And in his memory there suddenly surfaced a name the whole town had nearly forgotten, a female reporter who had once stirred public attention for a short time before abruptly falling silent. The woman's name was Priya Sandoval, a sharp investigative journalist for the local weekly paper that had been gasping for funds, and many months earlier, right after Tom died, she had published an article questioning the suspicious nature of the tunnel collapse, daring to publicly suggest that the miner's death was not as simple as the mining company claimed. Sloane had his people quietly ask around and trace her to the small, shabby apartment where Priya was living on the edge of town, barely getting by, and when the door cracked open, he found himself facing a woman in her early 30s, with intelligent eyes shadowed by the exhaustion and wariness of someone who had once been driven into a corner. At first, she looked at the large, intimidating figure of the master of Ravenscar Mountain with distrust and fear, as though she meant to slam the door shut. But when Sloane, in his low and steady voice, mentioned Tom Holloway's name, and said he had not come to threaten her, but to seek the truth about that miner's death, something changed in Priya's eyes, a spark of something she had thought long buried suddenly flaring up, and after a moment of hesitation, she stepped back and let him enter. In the cramped room cluttered with papers, Priya told Sloane everything, her voice guarded at first, then gradually becoming urgent, as though all the resentment she had kept buried for so long had finally found a way out. She said she had sensed something murky from the beginning. When she investigated the tunnel collapse, had found inconsistencies in the company's statements, witnesses who suddenly changed their stories or vanished from town, and had written a first article revealing those doubts. But only a few days after the article appeared, she said, Cyrus Vane's people came to her, first with smooth offers of money and thick envelopes, and when she refused, with cold threats aimed at her life and the survival of the entire newspaper. The owner of the paper was pressured so severely that he was forced to take the article down and fire her. Her sources were silenced, and in a short time, she went from being a promising journalist to an isolated, unemployed woman living in constant fear and shunned by the whole press circle as a troublemaker. Sloane listened in silence, and when she finished, he placed Tom's leather-bound notebook on the table in front of her, told her about Tessa and Eli, about the snowstorm, about the lithium vein and the secret toxic dumping hidden within those pages, and Priya's eyes widened with every word he spoke, her hands trembling as she turned through the notebook, because this was the final piece she had been searching for in vain for so long, the physical proof confirming everything she had once suspected, but had never been able to prove. Then, as though answering that trust, Priya stood, pulled up a loose floorboard, and drew out an old tin box she had kept hidden for months. Inside were all the original materials she had gathered during her investigation: witness statements, photographs of the scene, copies of documents she had risked her life to obtain. Everything she had protected despite every threat instead of destroying, because somewhere deep inside her, she had stubbornly held on to the belief that one day, the truth would come to light. When Priya's documents were placed beside Tom's notebook, both people sitting in that small room realized that the scattered pieces were now beginning to fit together into a complete picture of crime, and a quiet alliance formed in that very moment, without the need for vows, only a slow nod and a look of understanding exchanged between the powerful man of the mountain and the silenced female journalist, two people who seemed to have nothing in common but carried the same fire for justice in their hearts. And when Sloane returned to the estate and told Tessa about Priya, about the fact that someone else had now taken their side, for the first time since the day Tom died, a faint but real glimmer of hope shone in the weary eyes of that single mother. And three people, the widowed woman carrying the pain of injustice in her heart, the powerful man carrying an old wound inside him, and the journalist carrying the flame of her profession that had never gone out, officially stood shoulder to shoulder and stepped into the fight against the darkness hanging over Hollow Creek. The next day, Priya was secretly brought up to Ravenscar Estate by Boone, and in the warm, spacious study, with a great fire roaring in the hearth, the three of them sat together around the massive oak table, spreading before them everything they had, Tom's leather-bound notebook lying beside Priya's tin box of documents, and they began the meticulous, tense work of fitting each scattered piece together to rebuild the whole story. Tessa sat beside them, her hands clenched tightly in her lap, and at first she almost didn't dare look at the pages carrying her dead husband's familiar handwriting. But as Priya gently explained each document one by one, she slowly regained her composure and became the person who provided the most important pieces, because only she knew how Tom had changed in the final days of his life, how quiet and anxious he had become, how there had been nights when he stayed awake in the woodshop until dawn, and mornings when he returned with a face weighed down by something he couldn't say. When the notes in Tom's notebook were compared with the investigative documents Priya had gathered, a clear and chilling timeline slowly emerged before the three of them, showing that in the weeks before his death, Tom had no longer been merely recording things in silence, but had begun to act. He had tried to collect more samples from the dumping sites, had secretly questioned a few people he trusted, and most importantly, according to a hurried note in the final pages, he had decided to bring everything he knew into the light, intending to contact authorities outside the town and report the Vane Company's crime of poisoning the water. Priya pulled out one of her documents, a recorded witness statement she had risked everything to obtain from a worker who later left town, and matched it against the final dates in Tom's notebook, and all three of them went still when they realized that the fatal tunnel collapse had happened only a few days after Tom began asking questions and quietly digging, exactly when he had come closest to exposing the truth. The inconsistencies Priya had once discovered now revealed their meaning when placed under the light of the notebook, the witnesses whose statements had suddenly changed, the tunnel where Tom died having already been sealed, for safety reasons, though somehow he had ended up there, the suspicious haste with which the death was ruled an accident and the victim buried. All those pieces, when set beside one another, were no longer coincidences, but drew a clear picture of a murder staged with careful skill. Sloane sat in silence, his gray eyes moving over each document, and with the sharp mind of a man far too accustomed to deadly schemes, he pointed out the final link, that the mastermind had used Tom's own work to set the trap, luring him down into that abandoned tunnel for some reason, and then causing the collapse, so everything would look like a tragic workplace disaster, a cruel but perfect way to silence the only man who knew too much without leaving behind the marks of a crime. When the truth finally lay bare in full, Tessa couldn't hold herself together any longer. She buried her face in both hands and broke down sobbing, not with the tears of weakness, but with the breaking grief of a wife who for months had been forced to hear the whole town curse her husband as a thief, only to learn now that Tom had not only been completely innocent, but had been a brave man who dared stand against evil and paid for it with his life. And that pain mingled with pride and a burning resolve to claim justice for the dead. Sloane placed his large hand on her shoulder, in a silent gesture of comfort, promising her with his eyes that Tom's sacrifice would not become meaningless, that the people who had caused all of this would surely have to pay, and the three of them began discussing the next step, how to deliver all this evidence into the hands of people with enough power and integrity to act. But just as that first spark of hope had been lit, the study door burst open, and Boone rushed in, breathing hard, his face tense, bringing urgent news that instantly froze the air in the room, that from the estate's lookout posts, Sloane's men had just spotted a mounted group, thundering up the mountain road toward Ravenscar, led by the tall, thin man in a black coat with cold hawk-like eyes, Garrett Pike himself, and this time he wasn't coming alone, but bringing a whole band of violent men with him, clearly having scented out Tessa's hiding place, and now coming to reclaim the prey that had slipped from their hands. The moment Boone's warning ended, Sloane rose to his feet, and the first thing he did was not reach for a weapon, but turned to instruct the housekeeper to take Eli into the safest inner room of the estate, where the boy was happily playing with wooden blocks beside a gentle nursemaid, and to make certain that, no matter what happened outside, the child's young ears would not hear it and his clear eyes would not see anything. Only when he was certain Eli was fully protected did he pull on his heavy coat, tell Tessa and Priya to remain inside behind locked doors, and walk alone into the wide snow-covered courtyard before the estate gate, and with only a low whistle from deep in his throat, the entire pack of enormous gray hunting dogs immediately emerged from hidden corners, silently spreading into a line around him, like a living wall of muscular shadows with golden eyes gleaming in the snowy light. Garrett Pike's mounted group thundered forward, and then stopped short before the gate at the sight, the horses neighing in terror and stumbling backward, the violent men on their backs instinctively tightening their reins, because standing tall in the center of the yard was the cold, towering figure of the master of Ravenscar Mountain, unarmed, yet surrounded by an entire pack of beasts, waiting only for their master's command to strike, and that fearsome commanding presence held more force than any gun barrel. Garrett Pike urged his horse forward, trying to hold on to his usual arrogance, even though his hawk-like eyes had already flickered with uncertainty, and in a shrill voice attempting to sound full of authority, he declared that the Holloway woman was hiding from debt and resisting a lawful eviction order from the Vane Company, that Sloane was harboring a lawbreaker, and that he demanded Tessa be handed over at once if Sloane did not wish to bring trouble upon himself. Sloane did not move. Not a single muscle shifted on his scarred face. He only spoke slowly, his voice low and cold as ice, saying that the woman was under his protection, that the papers they so proudly carried were nothing more than the product of a fraud he had already seen through, and that if Pike had even a trace of wisdom left, he should turn his horse around and go back down the mountain now, while he still could. Challenged in front of his men, Pike's face flushed with anger, and he ordered the fiercest of his thugs to charge forward and force the gate. But the moment the command left his mouth, Sloane gave the slightest lift of his hand, and the whole pack of dogs instantly surged forward with savage growls, their white teeth bared, driving the horses into utter panic. One horse reared and threw its rider into the deep snow, while several other men struggled to control their terrified mounts, and in an instant the fierce band that had arrived so boldly became a chaos of men trying only to stay alive. One reckless man drew a gun and tried to aim at the dogs, but before he could do anything, a huge animal lunged and clamped its jaws around his wrist, pinning him down until the gun flew from his hand and disappeared into the snow, and the man's shriek rang out with the growls of the beasts and the cries of the horses across the courtyard. But Sloane remained motionless at the center of that chaos like a stone in a raging current, his calm gray eyes fixed on Garrett Pike, understanding that he had been completely overpowered, that his ragged hired men could never stand against these beasts and this terrifying man. Pike ground his teeth and ordered a retreat in anger and humiliation, his hollow face twisted with both fury and fear, and before turning his horse around, he threw back a bitter threat that Sloane would regret this, that Mr. Cyrus Vane had other ways of taking back what belonged to him, ways even the master of Ravenscar Mountain and his dogs couldn't withstand. The battered mounted group dragged itself back down the mountain road. leaving behind a courtyard of churned, scarred snow and Sloane still standing in silence until their shadows vanished completely. Only then did he give a soft whistle and call the dogs back to his side, his face more thoughtful than ever, because he knew Pike's threat was not empty talk. He understood that men like Cyrus Vane, once brute force failed them, would turn to methods far more subtle and dangerous, and sure enough, the moment he returned inside, his instinct was confirmed because at that very same time, down in town, Cyrus Vane sat inside his mansion and decided to change the game entirely, no longer relying on violent men who could be beaten back, but instead wrapping his entire plot to steal the land in a flawless legal disguise, a trap made of rules and paperwork that he believed not even Sloane Ashford and his dogs could tear apart. Just as Sloane had sensed, only a few days after Garrett Pike's humiliating defeat at the gates of the estate, Cyrus Vane launched his counterattack, and it was a move far colder and more cunning than any band of violent hired men. Because the landlord understood that his true strength did not lie in fists, but in his ability to bend the law and manipulate the hearts of people. First, he had whispers planted throughout the taverns and market corners of Hollow Creek. A carefully crafted story claiming that the widow Holloway was not only the wife of a thief, but had now become a debtor fleeing the law, that she had taken refuge in the lair of the notorious boss on the mountain, and that the master of Ravenscar Mountain was using that simple-minded woman for his own dark schemes, a story woven with just enough poison to stir suspicion and turn two people who were truly victims into figures of doubt in the eyes of the townspeople. But the most vicious move Vane made was using his influence over the local authorities, who had long been tucked into his pocket, to announce that a public land hearing would be held at the Hollow Creek Town Hall, a proceeding that appeared fair and lawful on the outside, where ownership of the Holloway family's land would be settled decisively, once and for all, based on official papers and records. That was the cleverest point in his scheme, because Vane knew full well that the entire bank record had already been forged by him, that the documents proving the debt remained unpaid were all in his possession, that Tessa's real receipts were only private copies with no legal weight, and therefore a hearing based on paperwork would be the perfect trap, allowing him to seize the land and the lithium treasure beneath it in broad daylight without anyone being able to object, turning open theft into a lawful victory stamped with a red seal. He was even shrewd enough to publicly invite the whole town to witness it, because he was certain that once the forged documents were displayed before everyone, once that poor woman could produce no legally recognized proof to resist him, then any later accusation from her or from the mountain boss would become meaningless, nothing more than the desperate cries of bitter losers. News of the hearing reached Ravenscar Estate like a dark cloud falling over the hope that had only just begun to kindle, and when Sloane told Tessa and Priya about Vane's new move, a heavy silence settled over the study, because all three of them understood that this was an exceptionally clever trap, a battle in which the enemy already held every legal card in his hand. Tessa felt the familiar despair rising inside her, because she had already tasted the helplessness of standing before Pike's cold, forged records, had already learned too well that her naked truth carried no weight against a law that had been twisted, and she looked at Sloane with bewildered eyes, wondering what they could possibly do when the very thing that should have protected the weak had been turned into a weapon for the powerful. But contrary to her fear, Sloane's gray eyes glinted with a cold and sharp light, because he recognized that Vane's arrogance had accidentally created an opportunity, that the landlord, too confident in his forged papers, had willingly built a public stage before the entire town, and such a stage, if used properly, could become not only the place where he meant to legalize his crime, but also the very place where everything he had worked so hard to hide would be exposed. Priya, with the instincts of a journalist, immediately grasped the idea, and her eyes brightened, because she understood that nothing collapsed faster than a lie, when it was unmasked in front of the crowd it had meant to deceive, and the three of them sat together, their first despair slowly giving way to a new resolve, because they agreed that instead of avoiding Vane's trap, they would walk straight into it, would turn the hearing he had built, to bury them into the very grave for his crimes. And they would fight his lies not with violence, but with the weapon Vane feared most, the truth, to turn the hearing into a place where the truth could be laid bare, The three of them understood that they needed more than pages of paper. They needed a living witness, a voice from inside Cyrus Vane's own machine. And Priya, with the sharp instinct of a seasoned journalist, immediately thought of one person, a young man named Wade Conroy, barely past 20, who worked as a debt collector and errand boy for Vane's company, yet carried a face she had once noticed was always shadowed by a kind of unease, unlike the hardened numbness of the other hired men. Wade had come from a poor family in the region and had taken the job with Vane for food, wages, and the chance to escape poverty. But the deeper he was pulled into that machine, the more he witnessed things that wore away at his conscience day by day. Families pushed into the street, powerless people crushed beneath the heel of money and authority, and most of all, one secret he had learned by accident, a burden so heavy on his soul that on many nights he couldn't sleep at all. For once, while assigned to stand guard outside a private meeting, Wade had accidentally overheard Cyrus Vane and Garrett Pike speaking together over drinks about the tunnel collapse from that year, had heard the landlord admit with his own mouth that Tom Holloway's death hadn't been an accident, but a necessary thing done to silence a man who knew too much, and those chilling words had haunted him for months, turning him into someone who carried a horrifying truth inside him, but didn't dare breathe a word because he feared Vane's power and knew too well the fate of anyone who stood against him. What even Vane himself didn't know was that on that fateful night of eavesdropping, Wade, driven by some instinctive urge for self-preservation, had secretly used a small recording device hidden inside his coat to capture the entire conversation, a recording he had hidden away as carefully as a bomb that could explode at any moment, both a charm to protect himself and a burden of guilt for his own cowardly silence. Priya approached Wade in secret, not with threats or bribes the way Vane would have done, but with honesty and understanding. She met him in a hidden place, told him about Tessa and her little boy, about the innocent husband who had died wrongfully, and the wife who had been forced to carry both the grief of widowhood and the humiliation of an entire town. And she looked straight into his eyes and asked how he would live through the rest of his life, knowing he had held in his hands the one thing that could return justice to a broken family, yet had chosen to keep his mouth shut because he was afraid. Priya's words touched the exact wound festering inside Wade. The young man sat there with torment written across his face, his hands clenched together, because on one side, there was the paralyzing fear of Vane's power and the dark future waiting if his betrayal were discovered, and on the other side, there was the call of a conscience that had been suppressed for far too long, the image of the sickly mother and her little child that he could no longer push from his mind. At the same time, Priya had quietly carried out another important and dangerous move. Through the old professional connections still left from her years in journalism, she secretly sent a carefully worded letter to a federal inspector, known for integrity and toughness, someone beyond the reach of Vane's money and influence, informing him of signs of land fraud, poisoned water, and the possibility of a concealed murder in Hollow Creek, inviting him to attend the upcoming hearing in person as an objective witness for justice. Bringing in a force outside and above Vane to witness everything was the crucial piece that would allow the trap they were setting to work. Because no matter how sharp the evidence was, it still needed eyes with enough authority and honesty to recognize it and act. When Priya left, she didn't force Wade to answer at once. She only left him with silence so he could face his own conscience. And that night, Wade Conroy sat alone in the dark room, took the small recording device from its hiding place, held it in his trembling palm, and listened again and again to Vane's cold voice admitting the crime. And for the first time after months of running from himself, he felt the cowardice inside him begin to waver, the scales of his soul slowly tilting toward the light. And though fear was still there, he knew he was standing at the threshold of a choice that would decide not only the fate of other people, but the fate of his own soul. On the final night before the hearing, Ravenscar Estate stayed lit until late, and in the warm study, the group gathered one last time to review every detail of the plan they had prepared with such care. Sloane had understood early on that in this battle, he couldn't use the kind of strength familiar to him, couldn't use his dogs or fists or underworld power on the mountain, because doing so would only make him fall straight into the trap Vane was hoping for, turning him into a lawbreaker and staining the entire righteousness of Tessa's cause. And so he had chosen another path, a path he had despised all his life, but which this time would be the sharpest weapon of all, the very dignity of the law. He had paid to bring in from the big city a skilled and honest attorney, someone who would legally represent Tessa at the hearing, making sure that every piece of evidence they presented followed the proper procedure and carried undeniable legal weight. And Sloane himself would appear only as someone standing in support of the victim, a citizen providing evidence, not as a force imposing his will through violence. Priya had arranged for the federal inspector to be quietly present among the audience at the hearing, and she had also kept discreet contact with Wade Conroy, who even at this late hour still hadn't given a definite commitment, but had no longer refused either. A silence, all three of them quietly understood as the sign of a balance beginning to tilt. When every detail had been carefully discussed, and Priya and the attorney had withdrawn to their rooms, only Sloane and Tessa remained in the study, sitting beside the fire as it slowly burned low, and a gentle silence spread between them, the silence of two souls that had endured too much loss and no longer needed many words to understand each other. Tessa softly thanked him, not only for saving her life and her son's life, but for believing her when the whole world had turned away, for giving her back the belief that kindness still existed in this life. And Sloane, a man used to silence and solitude, opened his heart for the first time, telling her about his mother long ago, about the boy who had once knelt beside his mother's bed and helplessly watched her die beneath the indifference of an entire community. And Tessa listened with tears gathering in her eyes, because now she understood why a man so frightening could also be so gentle, why he was willing to do everything for a woman who had once been a stranger. In the flickering firelight, those two wounded people looked into each other's eyes and found there a deep harmony, an understanding that needed no name. And though not a single word of love was spoken, an invisible thread had bound them together, two lives that had once thought they would remain forever alone, now finding in each other a place where the heart could rest. But the greatest miracle of that night did not lie in the feeling beginning to bloom between them, but in the transformation taking place inside Tessa, because the woman who had once trembled while clinging to a doorframe, who had collapsed helplessly in the snow, who had bowed her head in silence before the insults of an entire town, now sat straight beside the fire, with a look Sloane had never seen in her before, a look burning with the will of someone who had stopped being a victim and had become a person brave enough to stand up. She told him in a small but steady voice that tomorrow she would stand before the hearing herself, that she would speak for Tom and for the honor of her family herself, that she was too tired of running and enduring in silence, that no matter how afraid she might be, she wouldn't let that fear silence her again. And Sloane looked at her with deep admiration in his eyes, because he understood that the true strength about to shake Vane's entire empire was not his dogs or his fists, but the courage that had just come alive again in the heart of this fragile mother. They sat together until the fire had become nothing but glowing red coals, each lost in private thoughts, yet joined by the same resolve. And when the first light of dawn on that fateful day began to rise along the horizon, tinting the snow-covered peaks of Ravenscar pink, the entire estate woke into an atmosphere solemn and tense, because everyone knew that today, at the Hollow Creek Town Hall, the battle between truth and lies, between justice and greed, would finally be decided. The Hollow Creek Town Hall was packed on that fateful morning, the whole town having come to witness what they believed would be the final humiliation of the widow Holloway, and Cyrus Vane entered with the grand bearing of a man certain of victory, a sweet, oily smile spreading across his bloated face, the gold rings on his fingers glittering as he calmly sat down beside Garrett Pike. The hearing began, and Vane had his people present to the council and the entire crowd the bank files stamped with official seals, loudly declaring that the papers clearly proved the Holloway family still owed a large debt that had never been paid, that the company's recovery of the land was completely legal and justified, and he looked at Tessa with the contemptuous gaze of a conqueror, certain that the poor woman had nothing in her hands except hopeless pleas of innocence. But this time Tessa was no longer alone and trembling as she had been before. She rose to her feet, her back straight and her eyes steady, with the attorney Sloane had brought in standing beside her, and the attorney calmly submitted to the council the original receipts Tessa had preserved, then requested that they be publicly compared with the bank file right in front of everyone. When the two sets of documents were placed side by side under the council's supervision, the sharp attorney pointed out one irregularity after another in Vane's file, numbers erased and written over in a clumsy hand, ink strokes in different colors, pages that appeared to have been replaced, gaps in the order of dates that no honest record book would ever contain, and the hall began to murmur as the fraud gradually revealed itself in the light of day. Vane tried to maintain his composure, loudly dismissing it all as the slander of losers, insisting that the woman's scraps of paper were forgeries. But his smile began to stiffen when Sloane stepped forward, placed Tom Holloway's leather-bound notebook and the investigative documents Priya had gathered before the council, and in a deep, carrying voice laid out the whole truth, that the land concealed an enormous lithium vein, that Tom had discovered it along with the Vane Company's crime of poisoning the water supply, and that this was the true motive behind the cruel eviction of a dying woman. The hall erupted now, in cries of shock and outrage, the townspeople stunned to realize that the water they had been drinking for so long might have been poisoned, and amid that rising wave of anger, a quiet man, who had been sitting among the crowd, observing in silence, stood up, introduced himself as the federal inspector invited to witness the proceedings, and demanded that the hearing continue under his supervision. Vane's face changed violently at the word federal, because he understood that this was a power beyond the reach of his money and local influence. But he still thrashed against it with denials, loudly rejecting every accusation, straining his voice as he declared that there was no proof tying him to Tom Holloway's death, that it had only been a tragic mining accident, and that no one could accuse him of murder. And it was at the very moment Vane shouted that challenge, when he arrogantly demanded evidence he believed could not possibly exist, that from the back of the hall a young voice rose, trembling but clear enough for everyone to hear. "There is proof. I have proof." Every eye turned toward Wade Conroy as he stood among the crowd, his face pale, but his eyes shining with a resolve that had finally overcome fear. In the breathless silence of the entire hall, Wade walked forward and handed the federal inspector the small recording device he had kept hidden for so long. And when the recording was played, Cyrus Vane's own cold voice echoed through the town hall, every word admitting that Tom Holloway's death had been arranged to silence a man who knew too much, and the young man choked out his confession that he had been too cowardly to speak for months because he was afraid, that he couldn't live another day with that guilt weighing on his conscience. The hall went dead silent, then exploded in a wave of shock. Cyrus Vane's face turned from purple red to ashen white, and he stammered denials, but his own voice on the recording had become a sentence no one could overturn, and all the arrogance and authority he had spent so long building collapsed in a single moment when the federal inspector signaled for his men to forwards and read the arrest order for him and Garrett Pike right there, before the eyes of the whole town. Not a single gunshot rang out, not a single drop of blood was spilled, only the naked and unshakable power of truth struck down the man who had believed himself untouchable. And amid that chaos, Tessa stood in silence, tears rolling down her face. But this time they were tears of release, because at last, after all those months of shame and suffering, Tom's honor had been washed clean, in front of the very people who had once cursed him, and her beloved husband had been proven not to be a thief, but a hero who had sacrificed his life for what was right. 3 months had passed since that fateful morning at the town hall, and the harsh winter that had once buried Hollow Creek beneath thick ice had finally given way to a warm spring filled with life. The slopes of Ravenscar that had once been white with the color of morning now covered in fresh green grass and wildflowers blooming everywhere, while the icy stream of that old winter now ran clear and murmuring, carrying the breath of rebirth. Cyrus Vane and Garrett Pike had been taken to the city to await trial on a long list of charges, from forging documents, land fraud, and poisoning the water supply to the most monstrous crime of all, staging Tom Holloway's death. And the whole empire of lies that the landlord had built with greed and cruelty had collapsed completely, leaving behind a costly lesson for everyone who had ever believed that power and money could hide sin forever. Wade Conroy, thanks to his late but precious courage in standing up to testify and surrendering the key evidence, was granted leniency by the law. And that young man now began his life again with a lighter soul, having learned that it's never too late for a person to find justice again within his own heart. Priya Sandoval, The female journalist who had once been silenced and cast aside had her honor restored in glory. Her investigative series about the case that shook the whole region helped revive the local weekly paper with new strength. And she continued to write with the fire of her profession burning brighter than ever, becoming a voice for the powerless and the unheard. As for Tessa Holloway, after all those months of humiliation and loss, she finally had everything that belonged to her returned. The precious land with the mineral vein beneath it was fully recognized by law as hers, and instead of selling it for a burst of sudden wealth, she chose to partner with a responsible and decent mining company to extract it safely, ensuring a long-term livelihood for herself and her son, while also helping repair the damage that the town's water supply had once suffered. But the most precious thing she regained was not money or land, but the honor of her dead husband, because now the whole town of Hollow Creek knew clearly that Tom Holloway had never been a thief, but an upright man who had sacrificed his life to protect what was right, and the eyes that had once looked at her with contempt were now filled with respect and belated shame. On the green meadow stretching before Ravenscar Estate, little Eli, healthy and radiant, ran and laughed beneath the warm spring sunlight, surrounded by the giant dogs that had once terrified the entire region and now played gently beside the little boy as loyal friends. And the child's clear laughter echoed across the mountainside, like a song of life reborn after the darkest winter days. Standing on the porch as she watched her son play, Tessa softly leaned her head against Sloane's steady shoulder. The man who had once been the dread of the whole region and had now become a peaceful refuge for her heart, and two people who had carried deep wounds of loneliness and loss found in each other a home, a quiet but enduring love that had grown from the coldest days of winter. Proof that after even the harshest winter, there is always a spring waiting. The story of Tessa and Sloane ended where it had begun, on Ravenscar Mountain, but the bone-deep cold of that first day had now been replaced by the warmth of human kindness, justice, and hope, and that is the most beautiful thing life can give to hearts that never stop believing in what is right. This story leaves us with a profound lesson, that a person's dignity is never measured by the property they own, or by the rumors the world places upon them, that true goodness and kindness are often hidden behind appearances society rushes to judge, and that no matter how strong the darkness of greed and lies may seem, truth and the courage to stand up for the weak will always be the greatest power capable of overcoming everything. In our everyday lives, we may not face tragedies as great as this, but each of us has moments when we must choose between staying silent and looking away or bravely speaking up for what is right. And it is those small choices that create the true worth of a human being. If this story has touched your heart, please click like, share this video with your loved ones, and subscribe to our channel so you can listen to more meaningful and compelling stories every day. How do you feel about Tessa and Sloane's story, and which part moved you the most? Please leave a comment sharing the feelings from the deepest place in your heart, because we always long to hear your voice. We wish everyone watching this video abundant health, a joyful life, peace, and love every day. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next stories.